Good morning.
Good morning.
You can do better than that. Come on. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Welcome Dr. Greg Carr and Doug Blackmon to the stage. So we have Howard University, University of Virginia represented. Both are academics and come to this from interesting perspectives. We are going to talk about race relations, and rather than give a long biography, I want them to kind of summarize their careers, and then we'll get into the discussion. So Dr. Carr, let me begin with you.
Let me see if we got it. This thing on? Sorry. Okay. What?
It's on off.
It's all right. Thank you, Brother Scully. I appreciate you for inviting me and to the Washington Center for inviting me back. This is really a remarkable learning space, I think, and so it's great to be back in the center and with most of you all for the first time, and also a fan of Doug Blackmon's work, so it's good to be sitting here next to you.
Thank you.
Absolutely. So very briefly, I was a theater major in undergrad, so if this mic didn't work, I was going to be able to project, I hope. First, my family go to college, Tennessee State University, then I went to law school at Ohio State University. After my second year, got some Buckeyes out there? But I decided I wanted to be a classroom teacher. I spent the summer at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in New York. I thought I was going to do civil rights law, which I know we'll be getting into in a minute. And then I said, nah, I think I want to teach. So I went back to school, got a PhD at Temple University in Philly. Philadelphians out there. Yep. Right. And I spent the last 17 years after working for the School District of Philadelphia doing some working curriculum and instruction. I've spent the last 17 years here in D.C. at Washington's Howard University, where I'm currently the chair of the Department of Afro-American Studies and adjunct professor over in the School of Law. So I have an open invitation. I don't know when you would do it, but I teach a class over at the law school. We can talk about that a little later, because the last time I was here, I gave that invitation. And some of y'all follow me up on it. So, you can always come sit in on class. So thanks.
He's been gracious with his time. It's an encore presentation for Dr. Carr, so we welcome you back. And a first-time appearance for Doug Blackmon. We welcome you, and I'm a huge fan of your work. It's an honor to welcome you here at the Washington Center.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here. My quick story is that I come from the Mississippi Delta, so I was born on one side of the Mississippi River, grew up on the other side in a little town in the middle of nowhere. And as it turned out, and this will relate to some of what we will talk about here, I was in the first class of children in Mississippi to begin the first day of first grade black and white together and go through all 12 grades of public education in racially integrated schools. And so that was my generation in Mississippi. Then I went to a little college in Arkansas, Hendrix College, great liberal arts school. Got some Marquis in here. Okay, Hendrix. Wow. Okay. There we go. Well, I was just there a couple of weeks ago. But I have been a newspaper reporter almost as long as I've been alive. I wrote my first newspaper story when I was 12 years old for the little local weekly paper in my town in Mississippi. And until about now, I've in one way or another been employed by a newspaper organization pretty much continuously since then. I'm not anymore. I just thought about that. So I worked at a variety of little papers along the way. The big metro paper in Atlanta, Georgia, which is where I still mostly live. But then I worked for a very long time, most of my career at the Wall Street Journal, and reported from all around America and all around the world. I wrote the book, that book right there, some years ago that has had a successful life, happily. And then I left the Wall Street Journal to go to work at the University of Virginia, but primarily producing and hosting a weekly television show called American Forum, which appears now, it's an interview, public affairs show that appears on about 250 PBS stations around the country every week. And I still write things every now and then to see where they pop up.
Well, we want to welcome both of them. And this is not a Democrat or Republican issue, but they're going to come to the table from different perspectives, and that's the goal here. Let me at the outset thank President Trump, because he has teed up the debate perfectly with the NFL. So we thank the President for his tweets and his comments. And I want to begin with that point, and then I want to talk to Doug about your great work. But Dr. Carr, your reaction when you saw what the President said, and is it a race issue or is it an issue of patriotism?
I think it's probably both, Steve. I think in some ways citizenship, certainly it's a legal identity, but it's been one that has been constructed, I think, in this country as a cultural one, parading as a cultural identity, I think. For me, America is less a nation than it is a settler state with many nations in it. And when you're looking at a person who, we don't know what Trump believes. You know, he contradicts himself in the same sentence. But when he entered that Alabama race in Huntsville, 90 miles from where I grew up, for one candidate, when he really had a visceral connection with the other candidate, you know, Roy Moore's people, so to speak, he tripped up on this controversy, I think. But the line he crossed wasn't obvious. It wasn't a question of the flag, it wasn't a question of even Colin Kaepernick, I think. When he called those boys sons of bitches. See, in Ebonics, now you're talking about my mama. And you got a lot of cats who, first in their family, go to college, many of them from poverty, and now they're millionaires and employees, but make no mistake about it, they are the wage earners. They're the reason why these guys got into this football business in the first place. So when you combine that cultural issue with the political economy of the NFL, several days later, Trump literally drove the owners to their knees to stop a slave rebellion. So it wasn't really even about the flag for me. You entered a conversation, you stumbled into a conversation with your white supremacists, misogynists, all the things we can attack. You stumbled into this by mistake, and you took one more time the third rail, and if he keeps doing this, eventually it's gonna fry him, but it may free us. So that's my general.
Doug Blackmon.
I think I almost completely agree with that. I do think that the specific language that the president used is critical on this. It's one thing, there have always been running controversies about whether somebody should stand for the flag, whether we should still say the pledge, whether school children should be required to say the Pledge of Allegiance in the morning before school begins. I mean, these are long-running things. And that actually become kind of boring in a way, people that didn't really have much resonance. So when this specific thing began, this was one of the last refuges of where there was this expectation of a kind of ritualistic salute to the flag. And in this case, it's in the contracts, in effect, it's in the contracts of the NFL players to do that. Otherwise, that's the other key the key thing underlaying all of this issue, why you can even make the case that a player ought to have to do this thing. But so the president wading into it originally just to be on the side of the people who think the flag should be waved vigorously at all times, their old-fashioned view, wasn't really all that remarkable, except that he was tangling with the most popular sport in the country. But it was when he said SOB, that's the thing, that did absolutely, because I grew up, where I grew up in Mississippi was a majority black place. I knew far more black people as a child, went to 80% black schools as a kid, and yeah, if you understand anything at all about the linguistically what you can and cannot say, as soon as I saw that tweet, I said, oh, he has crossed the line now. And so I was not surprised at all that there was such a sort of brotherly response from so many other players, and it was really more about that than any particular dimension of the flag controversy.
You want to follow up, I can tell.
No, I agree. I agree. I think the question is, what happens after that? I mean, certainly, and Doug's written about this. This is the area you're talking about, you covered. This isn't the populist group. This isn't the populists of the 1880s and 90s. I mean, you're not looking at an interracial coalition across class lines where there may actually be something to upend, and then you have the Klan, which isn't really from the poor whites, coming in and saying, wait a minute, y'all white now. I know ain't none of y'all got nothing to eat, but you are white. I mean, so we don't know what happens next, because now you're talking about millionaires, right? And you're talking about something, you notice the NBA is a very different response. Because the NBA, unlike the NFL, I think, or at least more so than the NFL, is a global sport. You may watching football in Africa or Latin America. Oh, they are. They call it soccer. We call it soccer here behind the times. Most things in America. But the NFL is an American sport. But notice how Adam Silver's trying to walk the razor's edge. Why? Because these cats right here, I mean, you got cats like Carmelo Anthony and them who are forcing trades, gonna sign with their buddies. What happens when, and for me, I think in terms of the notion of citizenship, the market, to sound like, I suppose, a conservative, we put the label on what you want, but to me, citizenship is much more exciting at this moment in American history in the politics of the market as it relates to race. Because the NBA, where you got these guys who have a little bit more flexibility, not as scared. I mean, you're seeing the NBA bend over backwards to try to appear progressive, whereas the NFL, you know, it's maybe the last plantation in major sports. You know, no, y'all gonna be quiet. We're gonna break y'all because Kaepernick is never playing again. I think in some ways he's like the Kurt Flood of this issue. We may get progressive, but this one here, if we let him back in, that's gonna give y'all a little bit too much power. So it's gonna be interesting to see how this thing spreads beyond the NFL as it relates to.
So let's take a step back. This is an academic institution, and point out that Doug Blackmon's work earned him a Pulitzer Prize. It was turned into an award-winning documentary. So walk us through the premise of a book that we all learned in civics, that the Civil War ended, the slaves are free, and yet, as you point out, it's slavery by another name through World War II.
Yeah, this book grew out of a long article that first appeared in the Wall Street Journal in 1991. It's hard for me to believe. 2001, in July of 2001, and then the book came out in 2008. So I spent 7 years from the initial article to the book actually coming out. But that first article was part of a series of stories that I was writing in the Wall Street Journal then that looked at a question that had begun to intrigue me in that, and just as an aside, at the Wall Street Journal, particularly in those days, every reporter and even most editors, as I was most of the time I was there, had to be a financial reporter. You had to you had to be able to do that. You had to be a fighting soldier in the reporting on the economy part of what the Wall Street Journal did. And so I did lots of very straightforward business coverage over the years that wouldn't be of a lot of interest to most of the people in this room, I suspect. But all the way through that, though, I was also always writing periodically on race and very complicated issues of race. And I had begun to do this series of pieces over the course of a couple of years that looked at the idea that in the United States, that we had never really dealt with the issue of the role of commerce in the racial oppression that had occurred in American history. And even the Civil Rights Movement was something that was about the state. The movement was about forcing the state to stop having laws that required black people to be injured every day. You know, that's what the movement was about. To stop preventing people from voting, stop having laws that say they can't live in certain neighborhoods, but to end all of these government actions that had caused so much harm to African Americans in the 150 years since the supposed end of slavery. But I was very aware, partly because in Germany in the late 1990s, some of you will know about this, there was a discussion going on in Germany about have we really confronted the role of business and the legacies of companies that used slave labor during the Nazi era? And then there were lawsuits brought by Holocaust survivors against the remnants of corporations that had done terrible things in the wartime period. And that became a big issue. It was something that in the United States there was a lot of interest in. The Clinton administration became very supportive of these lawsuits, even though they were, from a legal perspective, they were almost certainly doomed. There was no way they were likely to prevail. But in the U.S. there was this huge support for the idea that, yeah, if there are leftover issues from the Nazi era and the Holocaust, then we should definitely dig those back up and go after them aggressively. And so it occurred to me that it was interesting that we as Americans were so comfortable with that happening in Germany, but had never really asked the question of the same kinds of things that might have happened in the United States in our own most terrible history. And so I started looking at the role of commerce and, who banked with the Ku Klux Klan, who made money off terrible things that had happened in the past. And also, though, I began to just have a clearer awareness, even though I'd sort of grown up in the middle of all this, this awareness that in the end, segregation, the bad stuff that you guys know about historically, really, wasn't primarily enforced by the government. It was primarily enforced by business. It's bankers who wouldn't give a loan to black people. It's real estate agents who wouldn't sell a house to a black family. It's employers who refuse to give jobs to certain people. And in reality, most laws are enforced by business. The government doesn't make you pay your taxes, your accountant does, and your accountant makes you follow the rules. And so I started working through a whole series of things that looked at dimensions of that. And in the course of that, stumbled across a reference to a place in Alabama where at the beginning of the 20th century, there was a giant coal mine that had about 1,000 laborers working in it all the time who were supposedly convicts, supposedly people who had committed crimes, been convicted and sentenced to hard labor, the very old-fashioned way. But there was some question in the historical record of whether these were people who had actually committed crimes, or was it that the criminal justice system had simply been used to round up large numbers of indigent African-American men and force them into these coal mines, these horrifying coal mines at the time. And so I ended up spending about a year digging around on that and trying to answer that question, and then finally wrote this story that appeared in the Wall Street Journal about this one place, really. And it so happened that the coal mine was owned by United States Steel Corporation. So the most iconic American corporation, that has United States in its name. And when it was created in 1901, it was the original modern corporation. It was the first corporation ever in the form of corporations as they exist today. It was for a long time, the largest company in the world. And certainly one of the most powerful and influential in America through most of the 20th century. So the fact that it had operated this place where there was this question of whether there was slave labor at the beginning of the 20th century, 50 years after the end of the Civil War, was a powerful question. And so I wrote that piece and essentially established that yes, this was slave labor. It was not just harsh punishment for criminals. And so there was a big reaction to that story. And then I was sought after I was urged to write this book, and I refused to write it at first, but then finally agreed to try to do it. Then 9/11 happened, and I got distracted into investigations around 9/11 for a while, but then finally I came back to this and then spent years and years. And along the way, I realized at some point that, this isn't a story about one bad place and one bad company, that in reality, what I was working with was a lost chapter of American history in which hundreds of thousands of people had been forced back into a new kind of slavery that was very little different from the old kind of slavery, and that this was an endemic thing that radically altered the lives of not just the people who it happened to, but the millions of people around them, and that this was something that went on all the way up to the very beginnings of World War II. And so it turned into a very radical kind of claim, and I wondered whether anyone would accept it, but in the end it did. And then it won the Pulitzer Prize. There we go.
It's an incredible book. If you have a chance, get it on Amazon. Let's take the arc of history a little bit more broadly, Dr. Carr, because if you look at, you point out in World War II, the segregation of blacks and whites, Jackie Robinson breaking the barrier, the election of Barack Obama more recently, the civil rights movement of the 1960s, where you had a President John Kennedy who initially was reluctant to embrace the issue, but then of course did, and then was assassinated. LBJ carries through the civil rights movement. And then what happened just a few weeks ago in Charlottesville, Virginia. My point is that we seem to heal and then pull off the scab. Make some progress and then pull off the scab. Is that a fair analogy?
Interesting. Well, let me ask Steve and Doug too, and you think about this. At what point was the body ever well? Because the metaphor of healing presumes that there was a body that was well. And it's interesting when we talk about slavery being America's original sin. How do our First Nations family feel about that? The original sin was set to colonialism. So you see John Marshall and them cats in the Supreme Court with Johnson versus McIntosh, doctrine of discovery. I put my foot on it, which means I own everything I can see. That's the original crime. So since then, I think the attempt has been to talk about to form a more perfect union. I think that metaphor may be more appropriate in the sense that it was never, as Langston Hughes said, America never was America to me, but this I vow America will be. It's an aspirational identity. So the language of healing and progress and regress to me has to be framed by that initial, if we can agree on that we've never been well. In fact, there's really never been a we as such. Then we can maybe put those things in context. So just very quickly, yes, Jack Robinson becomes the first African born in America, out African, I should say, to integrate white Major League Baseball. Because before him, if you went playing the white Major Leagues, all you do is say you were Cuban or Indian. So there were non-whites in white Major League Baseball. But remember, when he integrates in 1947, what collapses eventually? The Negro Leagues, the largest business in America. Because what has been laid down is this assumption that what black folks want is integration instead of full humanity. Those are two different things. And I think it's very arrogant in this country for the norm, the white norm, to be the definition of what it means to be an American. So we frame all the progress and regress relative to the white norm rather than other people. Yeah, John Kennedy had to be pushed, the bystander. We read the book, The Bystander. Yes, he had to be pushed. Lyndon Johnson, coming out of Texas, understands the issue very differently. And through an accident of fate, becomes the President of the United States. I'm not saying it was fate November 22nd, 1963, but I think it was fate that he was put on the ticket because you got to carry the South. Why? Because from the beginning of the Settler Project, you got to keep the slaveocracy pacified. Which is why, from the beginning, the Electoral College, all this kind of stuff, you got to keep the slaveocracy pacified. That's why the Catholic from New England has to put the Southerner from Texas on the ticket, because they still saying you're not quite American. You take your orders from the Pope. Again, white supremacy in America is a very interesting thing. But then he becomes president. What does he do? In that window, he goes back to put teeth in, under Section 2 of those Civil War amendments, the laws that are already on the books. Slavery, 13th Amendment, involuntary servitude clause, which is where Doug picks up, except as punishment for a crime which the person will be duly convicted. Oh, wait, you didn't get rid of slavery? No, we gotta circumscribe it. Wage slave. But at any rate, criminal, all these offenses. 14th Amendment, equal protection of the law, that the corporations then began to take advantage of and say, we're people too, my friend, in the 19th century. The Lochner case, which is a case on economics, there's a footnote in it that says, well, you know, we should let these people have as much flexibility as possible, but there are certain groups that should be protected. Race, maybe, you know, we'll get any law that's passed that deals with them, we might look at that a little bit closer, what they call strict scrutiny in the law. I'm saying that was an accident in this footnote, and now you got protections that can lead Johnson to come in with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Fair Housing Act, which gets passed in the wake of the assassination of Martin Luther King. And then what do you have? From the mid-60s to now, there has been a visceral response, a reaction, grounded in the states, from people who feel like somebody took something from them, which if they waited 15 seconds, they realized these guarantees should apply to everybody. But some kind of way, in Tennessee, where I'm from, Alabama, Mississippi, Vermont, who knows, but you know, you're taking away my rights. So it seems to me finally that the progress we've made is largely symbolic, and the regresses we've made all go back to that grounding, founding moment when the structural inequality was literally woven into the Settler Project. And we've been fighting ever since. I don't know what happens. We may not be here in 100 years. Because next people gonna yell states' rights may just be California, may just be Texas. Say, why are we here? Why are we staying? We can just turn to the east and deal with China. Or go to the south and deal with Mexico. Y'all want this part of Tijuana? We're gonna take this wall now. Why don't we just reintegrate? Because the demographics have changed now, and the very same people yelling states' rights now gonna be screaming bloody murder, federalism in 100 years.
And Doug Blackmon, Charlottesville is now a touchstone for all of this. Why?
Well, actually, I think that's a bit of a fluke in some respects, though it does have to do with Jefferson in many respects. And just coincidentally, the events that you saw on television around what happened on August 12 and 13 in Charlottesville all happened about a block and a half from my apartment in downtown Charlottesville. So I walk by those statues all the time in the half of my life that I spend in Charlottesville. And so but what happened there is a curious combination of things that in a way are also irrelevant. You know, the real relevance of Charlottesville is what it means to the whole country, and the fact that really it's a sequence of events that could well have happened almost anywhere. And the reason it happened in Charlottesville is because one particular extreme right-wing, you know, neo-Nazi, tiki torch Nazi, as I like to call them, you know, is a graduate of the University of Virginia, and I think understood, I'm talking about Richard Spencer, but understood that Charlottesville would be a perfect place, you guys will understand this, I think, for a particular kind of confrontation that they wanted, and that was not a confrontation with black people. You know, they wanted a confrontation with a group that looks more like this, that looks like educated, presumably, a TV audience would say, presumably progressives, mostly white or mostly lighter skinned. They wanted a confrontation in which you would see college girls acting hysterical and maybe looking awkward and in physical confrontations with these guys who they believed would look strong and embodiments of male and traditional superiority. They were looking for that because that visual is much less clear that this is about grotesque white supremacists, neo-Nazis who would like to see all the Jews and non-white people dead. You know, that's not obvious in that picture. Instead, it looks like, well, here are these white kids, these ridiculous white kids getting out of control, and their Antifa buddies that they don't seem to have a problem with. And so there was a very deliberate calculation on the part of the organizers of that, and then it became a bunch of other things as people glommed onto it. But there's no doubt that the other critical element was that Charlottesville is this place that is the home of 3 American presidents, including arguably the most influential of all American presidents, Thomas Jefferson, in terms of shaping these aspirational national ideals. And so the idea of this happening there, and also the extreme right guys, most of them are not smart enough to process this, but instinctively, some of the leadership there, they do realize that they love the Confederate monument controversy, and they don't particularly care about Confederate monuments. I mean, some of the hangers-ons do, but what they love about that issue is the sort of confusion that President Trump expressed, and whether it's confusion or that he actually has genuine instincts and sympathies, white nationalist sympathies, which I'm afraid he probably does at a more subconscious level than conscious. But when he said this thing that we've all heard said many times about, well, you know, essentially, where does it stop? If we take down Jackson and Jefferson or Robert E. Lee, then do we have to take down, dismantle the Jefferson Memorial or the Washington Monument because they were slaveholders as well? That's a grotesque misconstruction of the issues, but they love the idea of that because essentially, from a progressive point of view, it's a difficult thing to answer for a lot of people, but from the other side, it's a proof that slaveholding was a perfectly fine thing to do and was an American tradition. And of course, that's true. You know, we live in a country that is founded on slavery, and there's no escaping that. This is our entire country, and there's no regional escape for this. This is a country started as a slaveocracy, and white supremacy is written into the U.S. Constitution. And it is something that we have, just as you were saying, so much of our history has been about wrestling with this aspirational ideal and how it conflicted with the reality of what America was. And those are not issues that have vanished, even though those old forms of slavery have. And so Charlottesville, I think, brings together a lot of those things. In my view, Charlottesville is really it's not a demonstration of an enormous new surge of Nazi activity in America. It is a demonstration of how the internet and social media and a certain sophistication of some of these people has allowed these, toothless scragglers from all across America to find each other and appear to be more significant than they are in some respects. And they then have been able to bring in some other parties and some other people. But I don't think that's really the issue. The issue are these underlying ones of that we still don't really understand our history as it relates to these things and how it relates to the present. And we don't like to talk about it. We don't really want to resolve those things. And that's fertile ground for conspiratorial people with bad intentions to try to exploit the ignorance of the American people.
Greg, I'll get you on this in just a moment. By show of hands, Robert E. Lee or a Confederate soldier, how many of you think by a show of hands that those statues, those monuments need to come down? And those who think it should stay up? Interesting. So we have two different points of view on this.
So we also will, at some point, we have to talk about which statues we mean, but that's a distinction we can get to.
Man, it's complicated. And we were all teachers. So, wow. Airbnb Rakim remix paid in full, 1986. What do you do in a situation like this? Special mix. But I'm saying that because What do you do in a situation like this? Meaning what? The United States of America. Erasure is what this country does best. Gil Scott Heron said the great poet song, what this country loves is nostalgia. They want to go back as far as they can, even if it's only the last 10 years, but they want to edit it as they're going back. I grew up in Tennessee. Nathaniel Bedford Forrest, of course, late of the Confederacy, then helps found the Ku Klux Klan, then walks away, according to Ken Burns then, when he says it gets too violent even for him. But Middle Tennessee State University, I went to the historically black school, Tennessee State University in Nashville. MTSU's mascot was the Blue Raiders, which was kind of a riff on this Klan stuff, and Nathaniel Bedford Forrest was kind of a hero in Tennessee. So every time MTSU would come play Tennessee State, and we see black ball players say, how y'all gonna play for a school that's celebrating the Confederacy? Do you even know what a Blue Raider is? Guys trying to shoot free throws. Do you know what a Blue Raider They changed the mascot, just like Ole Miss, and a bunch of the Ole Miss got a dog now or whatever. Now they got a little, they keep calling it Blue Raiders, but now they have a dog too. Now those cats have scrubbed clean in history. And they can go forward, except when the police stop them, somebody gets beat. How are you going to explain to them that that's part of a long-standing tradition when you're going back and sanitize? Now, I'm not saying those statues should be kept up because they celebrate Confederate heritage. I'm saying perhaps they should be kept up because they celebrate a moment post-Brown. They celebrate a moment post-Reconstruction. So let's not link it to the Civil War. Let's link it to the continuing fight over white supremacy in this country. Because once they get taken down, and you start doing stuff like, let's put Harriet Tubman on a $20 bill, and let's put up a statue for Octavius Cato in Philly. Okay, but did it change the structural conditions? Or did you just edit the narrative in a way that means we're going to fight this again in another 50 years or 100 years? So I guess the special mix I'm talking about is one where, for me, keep them up until we create the conditions where there's not even debate about taking them down. Because if you take them down, the conditions may get to recede into the background so deeply that when people say, but the police, hold on, let's meet the Harriet Tubman statue and reinforce the fact that once again, what else do y'all want? That's where I.
And you come down different, slightly different.
Well, yes, and maybe significantly different in some respects, though I think we agree on the principles of it all. But for the longest time, and I've been writing about and talking about Confederate monuments for 25 or 30 years, I think, and I grew up in a world that was just soaked in this Confederate nonsense. And it wasn't until I was really a college student that I began to absorb that, oh, okay, this version of things that I absorbed culturally, even though I grew up in a very, by Mississippi standards in the 60s and 70s, a very progressive white family, but my parents were also first off the farm people and first to go to college in their own families, and were not historians, so they were just as steeped in the old stories as I would be as a kid. But obviously it was clear to me that it was actually a good thing that the South had not succeeded in destroying the United States. So I had figured that out. But the broader story of just how much of all of the lore and the stories and the symbols were what a sort of bogus account of history that was. I was probably an adult before I began to really understand that. But when I was a kid, my Boy Scout, my patrol in the Boy Scout troop that I was a member of were the rebels, and I've still got this little wall hanging thing with all these Confederate battle flags with their names painted over the flag. So the stuff was all over the place, and I was pretty fascinated with monuments even as a kid. I paid attention to them whenever my family would travel around, and I was just fascinated by these things. And there is this curious thing that I've noticed even as a kid that, boy, there's one of these everywhere. It seems like every 400 or 500 yards there's a monument to the Confederacy, but there's not for, what about all these other wars? Here or there's a World War I monument. By then there were World War II monuments, but nothing remotely like the Confederacy and like the Civil War. But so I had an interest in them and began to wonder again. Just coincidentally, after I began to do a lot of reporting out of Europe in the 80s and the 90s, and particularly in Germany and Austria and then Eastern Europe. And one of the things that struck me particularly in Germany and Austria, was that war monuments erected after World War II, there are exceptions to this, but generally speaking, if an existing monument survived the war, then the war memorial for World War II to German soldiers or anyone else who fought for the Wehrmacht there'd be a modification made to the World War I monument. So there's some German monuments where there's a soldier there, and then there's there's a block of stone next to it that has the World War II names, and so those are military-looking monuments. But if you see that in Germany, almost always, it's actually a World War I monument, not a World War II one. But in the places where the new monument was put up after the war, it is, generally speaking, a very spare block of granite that has on one side 2 words, Unsere Helden, our heroes. And on the other side, it has 2 lists of names, those who died in World War I and those who died in World War II. And I was struck by the plainness of these monuments as opposed to everything I'd grown up seeing related to the Civil War. And eventually I came to better understand that, because the Germans have all sorts of still their own hang-ups and problems on some of these issues, but at least I began to understand that there was a society that, under the heel of the victors, was forced to confront these issues in a much more straightforward way, and to recognize that since time immemorial, human beings have respected the right of the living to grieve the dead, and that every mother has a right to grieve the loss of a son, even if they died for a bad reason, even if they died fighting for a wrong cause. In the Civil War, in many, many places, it was Union soldiers who buried the Confederate dead at the end of a battlefield. So that's okay, honoring the dead. But glorifying the terrible thing they were fighting for is a very different thing, particularly when you're talking about a group of people who were fighting to destroy the country that won. And so, essentially, sometimes it's easier to think of it in this German-American sort of comparison, because we're all clear on what was bad about Nazi Germany. And so it's almost as if what happened in the United States was the equivalent of if at the end of World War II, the Allies had made it to Berlin and found the burned body of Hitler, and the German High Command surrenders, and the war is over. And then if the Allies essentially had said, okay, we're leaving, do whatever you want, just don't start killing Jews again. If you try to kill all the Jews again, we're going to come back. But otherwise, just do whatever you want. If you want to call yourself Nazis, if you want to preach that, almost all the Jews are dead already here, or gone already, so it doesn't matter that much. But if you want to demolish the remaining synagogues, that's fine. If you want to espouse these crazy racist ideologies, believe anything you want to. Glorify Hitler, put statues back up to him, call yourselves Nazis forever. Anything you want, that's fine. We're gone. Just don't attack Poland again, and don't start the Holocaust back up again. Essentially, that's what happened in America. That's what the North said to the South. Said, look, okay, just don't, you can't have slavery anymore, though this guy's going to come along in 100 years and say you did. But don't do it in an open, obvious way. But everything else is fine. Do whatever you want. Glorify the leaders of the rebellion. Put up statues to them everywhere. Declare that your society was the better one. Teach your children that lie. Tell them they have to teach their children that lie. Undermine the ideals of the country that you're a part of. Do it as long as you want, and the rest of the country's not going to say anything about it. That's what we did. And now we're at this point in time where finally there is this collision between the ideals and the iconography of all of this that I think we're finally being forced to reckon with. And for a long time, I said essentially what Greg says, that the statues could somehow be curated. That maybe you could at least put a sign up next to them that says, well, this isn't what we think anymore, here's why this thing is here, or put a statue up of some next to those monuments to someone who opposed secession or opposed slavery. For a long time I thought maybe that was the way, but here in these recent times, I finally, and Charlottesville what happened there did push me over the edge, that, okay, it's just, in fact I tweeted out at one point that, white Southerners have had 150 years to figure out how to honor the dead without insulting the living. Time is up. And that's my view. Time's up on this. Now, there are still some intricacies to that, but basically, it's time for the state and for our society to keep saying these things. And every time a county worker goes out to the Confederate monument in front of the courthouse with a leaf blower and blows the leaves away from the base of it and gets a toothbrush out and scrapes the bird poop off the statue, that is it's an expenditure of public funds. It's a decision by that government to maintain this thing. So every time that happens, it is a re-expression of whatever that statute says. And what that statute says to a young African-American woman who's coming down to the courthouse, who's compelled to come down to the courthouse to get her first driver's license and to go do this business with the state that she must do to have a full life as an American, and she has to walk in front of this thing that is saying to her, this was a better country when people like you were enslaved. And that's what those statutes say. That, in my view, is something that at this stage is unacceptable. And those statutes have to go. Statutes that just honor the dead may be in a different category, that respectfully honor the dead in the right places, in cemeteries, with the dead, and don't glorify an evil cause. Maybe that's a different thing. But these statutes at the center of commerce and the center of government activity that say these terrible things and that we require people to see and hear, those have to go.
Can I just state the obvious, that you are part of an incredible, thoughtful, and a very important conversation. We're only midway through, but I want to thank both of you for being with us because this has been an eye-opening morning. We'll get to your questions if you want to line up. Personal question for you, Dr. Carr. How have you seen racism through your own eyes, your own experiences?
It's on Facebook Live, isn't it? My niece put it on. Steve, man. You know, Doug, listening to you at the very beginning narrate your life journey. I was in that first generation of folks who were bused in Tennessee. If my church had looked like my school, I don't know that I would be sitting here. If my school had looked like my church, I don't know that I would be sitting here. Black children who were bused anywhere from half an hour to an hour or more into the suburbs to go to school with white children, giving us access to resources we wouldn't have had otherwise. So, you know, my childhood probably looked very similar to some of you all, or at least probably your parents, many of your childhoods. Comic books, Star Trek, you know, stuff like that. Then you come home, and it's not the conversation in your black community, since gentrified, by the way. Waging war to keep my mom a little house in Nashville. My brother's trying to keep me out of jail, because if I see one more neighbor walk down and not say nothing to my mom who's been there for 60 years, we're gonna have a real beef. But at any rate, so growing up, it was an integrated lifestyle. Of course, the public sphere is not integrated. So you turn on TV at night. That's why Martin Luther King said he wanted to meet Nichelle Nichols, who played Uhura on, ironically, Kiswahili for Freedom, which is why Gene Roddenberry put that in Star Trek. He said, I want, because Coretta and I let our kids stay up to see you because there's so few black people on TV and you're a role model, that kind of thing. So we grew up in that same world. Somebody black's on TV, call everybody to watch. In the arc of the 52 years I've been on the planet, it has changed now so that, as my friend Greg Tate, the culture critic, writes, in America, folks want everything from black people but the burden. So now black is everywhere. It's just like a boutique kind of thing, you know, everything, you know, the music, the dance, everything, but the structural arrangement hasn't changed. So when I look at the Confederate statues that I grew up seeing, my mother's from Russell County, Alabama. Tuskegee Town Square got a Confederate statue, but see what they did in the South, a lot of places, as you know, it's private property. Daughters of the Confederacy got said, that's not a state thing, so they can, you know. But then I see the cop, and it's like the statue came off the base and it's you. So taking the statue down doesn't change the structural arrangement. As I got older, and as I went to school and continued to study, and now as I teach, what I see is that, and how I've experienced racism is that the fear I felt, no, I'm sorry, fear is the wrong word. No, fear is an honest word. The apprehension that I feel when I see the cop in the rearview mirror, regardless of the color of his or her skin. The constant awareness, I'm telling you right now, I asked some of y'all friends, and some of y'all can spot a cop 3 blocks back to the left, and you know, do I keep going straight? Because if they're on shift, they're gonna make a turn in a minute. Do I keep, in other words, that perpetual apprehension is how I experience race. So these debates on what to do or what not to do are almost meaningless to me in a lived sense, because the structural arrangement, as far as I'm concerned, will never change. In that regard, I feel like my friend Derek Bell, late Derek Bell. Racism is permanent in this country. The question is now that when we will acknowledge that, what can we do past that to change the arrangement? But my daily experiences of race is extremely stressful. I'm sure I'm gonna die a lot sooner whether it be through the stress-induced constriction of my arteries, or a bullet, or a black kid or a black dude or woman shooting me or beating me up, in part because that expression of hatred toward me is really self-hatred pushed outwards. Black people doing it to themselves. Do y'all understand why? It's the structural arrangement. So I don't expect that I'm going to live as long as I would have lived if I had been in a homogenous society, like in the Scandinavian countries, perhaps closer to Germany, where you can deal with that because there's a national cultural identity you're trying to rehabilitate rather than a settler state you're trying to squeeze into an idea that never existed anywhere as far as I know in world history. So that's how I experience it.
Wow. On that note, questions. Please introduce yourself. Keep your questions brief so we get a lot of time for answers.
Hey, my name is Janiyah Banks. I go to Dickinson College in Pennsylvania. I'm from New York City, Queens to be exact.
Queens.
Yes. And my question is talking about the structural way of racism and how more about taking the statues down. We can take the statues down in Virginia, but if their textbooks are telling them, like, this is the way the war was and this is the things that we believe, and still celebrating Robert E. Lee and things like that, how are we fixing the problem? So I think that I want to know your thoughts on how, if public school education and really elementary education is the place to start with trying to change these thoughts.
Doug Blackmon.
Sure, and of course, there's no one thing. Of course, taking down the monuments means about 700 things, depending on how you define them, but there is no one thing that solves any of these things, particularly these kinds of implicit, sometimes invisible, sometimes not so invisible mechanisms of our society. And by the way, just as an aside, to underscore how much I agree with that general idea that symbolic changes may or may not really have all that much immediate effect, but an observation I often try to get people to think through is that if you look at the history of African American economic and educational attainment and achievement since the end of the Civil War, or even, and actually if you look at it since the end of the Civil Rights Movement, the sort of the high point of the Civil Rights Movement, what you see in African Americans is, I would argue, and I think I could mathematically prove it, you have, even with all the problems, even with all the things that we're so frustrated about, you actually also have the most extraordinary performance, the greatest economic and educational performance of any ethnically identifiable group of people in human history. That once African Americans were in fact liberated for them in some fashion, some defense, you could defensively say liberation of a form has happened. Once African Americans in large numbers had access to the mechanisms of achievement in American life, their use of those mechanisms and their hard work and talent and pursuit and all these various things, the things that have made being blackness a boutique product of such a powerful thing, has been extraordinary, even with all the bad stuff. And so what that demonstrates is that, well, then what was the explanation for the previous 100 years, where, the slavery supposedly ends? This was a driving logic behind my book. If you read the introduction to it, I talk in there about how that original Wall Street Journal story, when it came out, one of the reasons I ultimately did agree to write the book was I got all these emails and letters and phone calls from young, high-achieving African Americans, somebody like you, who read the original story and said, I knew there had to be another explanation. I knew that being called the N-word and my grandparents not getting to vote did not explain the world that I live in, And then that would compel them to say, some of them could be more plain about this than others, that to confront this unspeakable question, really, where they would say, I've been asking myself, is there actually something wrong with us? Is it actually true somehow? Because, black people are infected with white supremacy too. We all carry that infection in one manner or another. That's unavoidable if you live in America. The question is how you manage that infection. But this idea that finally I began to say to people, look, it's just math. Either there are structural explanations, mechanical structural explanations for the difference in performance, economically and educationally, between whites and blacks in America, and now other groups as well, in that 100 years. Either there's a structural explanation, or you're a white supremacist. Either you think there's something wrong with black people, or you accept that there are these mechanisms and attitudes that are the explanation. And so all that is just to say, you're right, that we are talking about gigantic structural dimensions of this society. And so getting rid of all the monuments is not going to fix that. But I will say that the monuments were put up for a reason, as particularly one group of them, the ones that, the majority of them. Not the ones that were put up immediately after the war. Those tend to be ones that are in the cemetery and really were about the dead. But there's this other group, and these are the great majority of them. They were put up in the 1910s, the 1920s, and that was part of a process of reasserting total white control over African Americans, and then putting these things up to say to black people, you are never going to go back to any version of being a citizen that maybe you thought you were, or that your parents thought. And that message that they carried then was very powerful, and was a part of creating that world. And so my point in saying that is that taking those messages away now doesn't fix everything, but it is part of, in my opinion, of acknowledging that changing the messaging is a part of changing the structural systems. And it's a little bit like if you've ever known anybody who's gone to the hospital and gotten a terrible infection that can't seem to be controlled. Sometimes the doctors just have to go in and start cutting stuff out. And they can't get to the very bottom of it maybe, or the medicine doesn't get rid of it. Sometimes they just got to cut out the infected stuff. And as much of it as possible, and then maybe they can defeat what is at the center of it. And to me, the statues are a bit like that. It's just time to cut them out. They are a piece of rot in the body of America.
And at the same time, Dr. Carr, that these statues were coming up, members of the KKK were not just a group of farmers. They were community leaders. They were sheriffs. They were police officers who were burning crosses and promoting their own ethnic purity.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I think it's interesting. One thing, and those who haven't had the opportunity, for me, I hate to put one age over the other, but if I had to pick a moment in time in American history that to me is the most progressive moment, it wouldn't be the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. It would really be the Reconstruction.
Yeah.
That's really when, if you look from the mid-1860s to the mid-1870s, that's as close as we got to trying something that never been tried before. And it was shut down by those uneasy coalitions. The plantocracy had been shattered, but then they still own the land. The northern industrialists, like Andrew Carnegie and these cats up by U.S. Steel, who go south and say, we need to educate this labor force. You got these 4 million black people, and the whites push back like, no, I don't want that to happen. Wait a minute. This will help us all. No, because racism is so deeply ingrained in them. However, you then got the blacks who are doing it for themselves. In other words, they just felt the lash. So there's a solidarity that it doesn't exist today. This magnificent diversity of America, the rationale for Lewis Powell's Bakke case thing, where he says affirmative action is about diversity and not remedying past wrongs. Now, you go back in the 19th century, it was about, what you're talking about, the 14th Amendment, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment is about reversing what has happened or changing what has happened. But that whole rationale shifts in the post-response to the Civil Rights Movement. Why am I saying all this? And you from Queens, right? How far back you go in Queens? How far back does your family go in Queens? Years? Before that, where were they? Harlem?
North Carolina.
North Carolina, okay. I'm assuming you grew up in a house with a yard.
Yeah.
Okay, that's why Negroes moved out to Queens. If you read Ira Katz Nelson's book, Fear Itself, and that's what you see is in the wake of World War II, when they got the GI Bill, when anybody hear people in the military?
No.
Okay, there were a lot of people who couldn't get a mortgage with their GI Bill funds because of the racism in the housing industry, this kind of stuff. And so as a result, when black folks moved out of the cities, when they migrated from the north, they moved into New York, but in places like Harlem and some of the other places, they couldn't get leases, or if they owned their property, that was a great thing. But they moved out to Queens and places like that to raise their children in places where they had yards and they were able to get good schools. Now, they didn't care whether or not the kids went to white schools or black schools. They wanted the kids to have a quality education. So I said all that to say that, and then I know we got a lot of other people, that's why I want to belabor this point. What we're facing, Du Bois wrote about this, again, in that heroic age for me, really, the 1860s, really up to the 1900s. W.B. Du Bois writes in The Suppression of the African Slave Trade to the United States of America. He said, the time to correct a moral wrong is when it occurs. He said, nobody would have looked with more shock at what happened in the Civil War than the so-called Founding Fathers. And for me, Madison is my favorite. This little dude got the whole Constitution in his head. He going to Philly trying to figure out what's going to happen, right? I lived 17 years in Philly, that's why I said it. They're heroic. But if I had lived during the time of James Madison, I would have been like those Igbo women in Montpelier. I've been trying to figure out how to poison him. Why? Because you came and got me and brought you. You will never be a hero. And I don't care whether Lin-Manuel Miranda, with all his genius, makes a minstrel show that seduces people into buying into that fake narrative. Listen to, watch it. Oh, you love Hamilton. Why? I've been trying to kill Alexander Hamilton and George Washington and Thomas. You're brilliant. Slit his throat. Why? I'm in chains. The dude just sold my children that aren't even born yet to mortgage because he want to add something to Monticello. Read Henry Wiesig's book, Master of the Mountain. We romanticize these cats. If we're going to make progress, in Germany they say never forget. They don't have statues to Nazis, but they didn't take down Dachau. They didn't take down Auschwitz. But here, we're going to sanitize this joint. And so in Queens, the home of hip-hop, Eric B. and Rakim, Run DMC, LL Cool J, all them cats, right? Is that an American story? Or is that a story of Africans who left Jamaica, like Clive Campbell, DJ Kool Herc, and them migrating, not because they wanted to come to America because it's the land of promise, because I can get a job and send the remittances back? By the way, shout out to Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico because they're part of America's empire of color and they're not citizens. I don't care what y'all say. Why? Because they ain't got no senators, they ain't got no Congress people, and they ain't got no help right now. But the point is that when you talk about places like Queens, where is the memorial to what people did that ain't tied to this lie of American exceptionalism? Don't sanitize anything if we're going to have a country. Now, if we're not going to have a country, do what you want.
Next question. Thank you for waiting.
My name is Colleen Anderson. I'm from the University of Toledo in Ohio. And my question is, given that we're acknowledging the fact that America was the body that was never well, how do we reconcile that with a desire for patriotism, with people in this country who want to be able to have some kind of national pride, and do you believe that's possible?
Doug, we'll turn back to you.
Sure, and that sounds hard, but it's not. And in fact, it goes back to what Greg was saying about, and what you just referred to, the thing, and I'm going to promise to give shorter answers than I've been given. If you go back to the most basic contradiction in the American creed is just all men are created equal. And the first version of that that's confusing to you even as a kid is why is it only men? Why was it only white men, et cetera, et cetera. I think generally we've looked at that kind of backwards, and we have these really complicated explanations for how all that worked, or they were men of their time, or whatever. But actually, what it really meant was what all men are created equal truly meant was that America, the colonies, and particularly the revolutionary dimension of the colonies, was that this was a place where all men could be royal. That's actually what it meant. That's what it meant. Because if you were coming from England and you lived in this world in which there were royal people and there were people who were not royal, and royal people had got to talk directly to God, and everybody else had to talk through somebody else to God, and royal people had all kinds of rights and privileges and opportunities and capacities made available to them that ordinary people did not. And so what America was about was saying, hey, all white Englishmen get to be royal. That's actually what all men are created equal means. And so, but the thing is, if you want to be royal, somebody has to be not royal, by definition, And so women don't get to be royal, people who aren't white don't get to be royal. And so much of American history right up to this moment is about that dilemma of that all men are created equal actually meant all white men from England are equal and special. And exceptional. And so reconciling that, just trying to get to where that makes sense and now includes every kind of human being in this society is the challenge. But being patriotic to that idea, to this evolving idea that if this country is in any fashion special, then that its exceptional nature is that even in the terrible, flawed, wrong framing of just giving this special status to white men, even as wrong as that was, there was still the Enlightenment idea that in the end, all human beings are the same, and all human beings are royal, and there is no one royal. That seed is still in there. And that's the American creed. That's what this country is actually about. That's the defensible thing. And we can be completely patriotic to that idea, and part of being patriotic to it is identifying the places where it has failed and being honest about them. And I can simultaneously know that my grandfather, now dead, the one of my grandfathers who I most absorbed my sense of what it means to be a man, and so much of my personal value system comes from this person who I loved and adored, and who was also a crazy fucking racist, white supremacist, you know, who participated in a mob attack on a black man when he was 16 years old, you know. I can reconcile those things. He did this terrible thing, he had these terrible ideas. He was also someone who deserved love, my love, you know, for many other things. But also deserves my denunciation of these other dimensions of his life. And I think that's what we all have to do. And it's actually not that hard.
Thank you for the question. We'll stay on this side and come back over to you. Go ahead, please.
Hi, gentlemen. I'm Lee Gross from the University of Toledo in Ohio as well. I want to thank you.
We're not going to ask you what a mud hen is, but that's another debate for another time.
I want to thank you both for being here to talk about these relevant and complex topics in a way that leaves space for different opinions. So although the new administration has opened, a new voice for explicit racism in America, we are living in a time of colorblind racism, contributing to a lot of these systemic and structural forces that we're talking about. So how do we get white Americans to acknowledge their privilege and racism in America when they so truly believe that it is a thing of the past?
Wow, that's a 3-hour answer. It's a very good question. Thank you. And I can see Dr. Carr pondering that.
No, I'm asking, when you have to ask somebody to recognize your humanity, have you already conceded it? That's why Black Lives Matter disturbs me. So, I know the young people involved in the movement for Black Lives Matter. I'm saying, as a child, imagine a parent coming to a child and saying, "My life matters," to the child. Child, like, what are you talking about? I know your life matters. If you weren't here, I wouldn't eat. If you weren't here, I wouldn't have any place to stay. So why are you telling me, why, or better yet, saying, recognize that my life matters? This is a parent talking to a child. Now, y'all at Toledo, right? Home of Art Tatum. Y'all know who Art Tatum is? Yes. The great piano player, right? That's what I said. When Art Tatum came in the back of the room from Toledo, Ohio, Pat Waller, the great pianist, said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I just play piano, but God has just entered the building." So, y'all go listen to some Art Tatum again. Art Tatum grew up in a deeply segregated society, coming out of Toledo, coming to the East Coast. His genius allowed him to be a human being in the world. It wasn't him asking somebody to recognize, "I'm a great piano player." No. He played the piano and let people respond. It seems to me that human beings have made progress when they have stood in their own truth and spoken their truth to the world with the respect for other humanity, rather than pleading for that humanity from other people. To me, what happens here in terms of colorblindness and racism, the constant plea reinforces the superiority complex. There's no affirmative action on the football field. That's why the NFL is 68% black. It seems to me, the level playing field means we're going to make some money, y'all play ball. I got to get the best ball players because I'm trying to make this money. No problem. Money is the thing? No problem. Look at all this diversity in sports. Why? Because we're trying to make some money. You don't see, now conversely, let's go to the White House press briefing room. You want to see affirmative action? Ms. Huckabee, Ms. Sanders, could you answer the question? No, I'm not going to answer the question. Next question. That's purebred affirmative action. You're not going to displace that by saying, when can we get a black person? Omarosa, could you switch out of it? No, that's not what we're after. The question is, do you want to be excellent? Do you want to create a society where human excellence will problem solve for everybody? If that's the objective, then we don't need to talk about colorblindness, because the best people will enable, and the structural inequality that led to the most progress, as you say, the most progress we've made as African people in this country since the end of enslavement, and the deepest economic separation between the black elites and the masses of African people who are suffering more now than they have at any point since the end of the civil rights movement. So yeah, they can pull a Negro like me out, and then go look and say, now what about those other people you left in Nashville? No, keep focusing on him. Look how much progress we've made. We haven't made any progress, we've actually regressed. The question is, what does the society want to do? Is it for all? Or is it just that radical inequality is a byproduct of the Enlightenment. And it may be different in Eastern societies, at least in theory, not in practice, or in some of the African societies or the Native American societies. But since the whole conversation got to be structured around John Locke, Rousseau, then go back to the Greeks and come forward in this lie called Western civilization, this cherry-picked narrative, then we're going to keep having these conversations because it all becomes an appeal to whiteness or the common humanity of everybody who ain't white, which is 90% of the world.
No doubt you have enlightened our eyes and also making us think, so we appreciate that. Next question over here, thank you.
Hi, my name is Shekinah Hollingsworth, and I'm from Salisbury University around the Eastern Shore of Maryland. Go Bulls. So I guess my one question is, what's the end goal? Because if American society is so embedded in white supremacy and in racism, so much so to the point where our own Constitution has white supremacy written in it, and from what it sounds like, the advancement of black people can't continue unless white people champion that challenge. What is the feasible end goal here if black people don't, what it sounds like, doesn't have their own agency because our society is so embedded in racism?
How would you answer your own question? And then we'll get their response. How would you answer that?
To allow black people to continue to have their own agency. I don't think that the progressiveness of the black community depends upon white people acknowledging their privilege, because for a constitution to be written in racism, we've had a lot of amendments to allow the progression of this society. So whether we do get rid of the Constitution and give it to people who have been oppressed, I don't, what's the feasible end goal?
Yeah, I like your answer, and it sounds to me like that you might be someone who shares my sentiment, for instance, about Ta-Nehisi Coates' incredibly important and now super famous book of a year or so ago, which I love very much, and I admire Ta-Nehisi immensely. But it also was a book that bothered me at certain levels because I thought that it ultimately was so bleak an assessment of American life and culture, and in particular the possibility of the roles of white people. And probably this comes from my own partial misinterpretation of what parts of what he may have meant. But in the end, it felt for me like a book that, and by the way, it's a book that white people seem to be, progressive-minded white people seem to be just obsessed with and considered to be absolutely required reading. And a lot of black intellectuals, kind of sit back and say, I'm not entirely sure about this book. But but it is interesting how white people run away with these things sometimes. But it's so bleak an assessment that I worry that it also suggests a kind of lack of agency, or that things are so terrible that at one point he even says we have to keep fighting even though we'll never win, basically. And that's not exactly what he says. That's exactly what he means, even, I think. But there's too much of that message, and I certainly don't want to be suggesting that. But I do think that. And I also don't need to hear myself or any other white people apologize for slavery to somebody else, or make gestures that primarily make them feel better about themselves or their ancestors. Those are not very interesting to me. What is interesting, I think, and powerful is what I call the power of tiny. And I have all these essay titles for essays I've never written. Maybe I will write this one someday. But the power of tiny is the idea that great changes in a society occur when very small evolutions are applied against huge populations with complete consistency and sustained over long periods of time. And so what that really means is that if you can move the median educational attainment of all the children in Jackson Parish, Louisiana, from the 4th grade to the 7th grade over the course of a decade, that is a revolutionary event. And if over the next 20 years you can move that attainment level from 7th grade to 11th grade, it's another revolutionary event. And if in the beginning white educational attainment is here and black is here, if you can move them any closer over a period of time, that is a revolutionary event. The giant change, the things that made America migrate from being essentially a third world country, which America was, the lives of the vast majority of Americans up until World War II were in a third world country. All the people in both my parents, all the extended members of my family were people who were born in houses, born in shacks maybe, born in houses without electricity or running water. They had the good fortune, in many respects, of being white, and so their lives were easier than the black people nearby. But people born into deep poverty that was endemic. A great-grandmother of mine starved to death in the 1920s. And so what was it that made America move from that world to the world that we live in now? It wasn't because everybody woke up one day and said, let's be better. You know, what changed was that there was a consensus of support, initially only to help white people with this. But there was a consensus that, no, we need schools, we need roads, we need these basic structural elements of society that enable success and enable people who work hard and maximize their talents and live free lives can succeed for themselves. But there are these other things that have to be part of that. Finally, we get to the 1960s, when black folks finally were in a position to say, well, hey, can we, shouldn't that apply to us too? And that's when you first begin hearing, no, the government's not in that business. No, government's not, doesn't do that. But we need to go back to this idea that collectively, and government is the expression of the collective will of the people, of all that should be, of all the people. And it is through the government, through these kinds of things, that we use the power of tiny. And we have to continue to build these basic systems that then everyone can employ. And yes, there's a big discussion to be had about, you need to call out racists. You need to point out that Donald Trump says, whether he fully understands it or not, when he's saying things that are explicitly racist or implicitly, sure, we should say it, we should demand that he stop, and others. But in the end, these broad changes are the ways that the fundamental structure changes, in my view.
Do you think the president is a racist?
I think presidents are racist in the sense that, well, as I said before, that every American is infected with white supremacy, and particularly some people really don't like to hear me say that. They don't like that idea, but I believe it. That everybody has the infection. It is inevitable, and it is a question of how we manage that infection. And if you are the object of, if you're on the negative side of white supremacy, you're probably going to do a better job of realizing that it's wrong and containing it. If you're on the positive side, the benefiting side of white supremacy, then you're a lot less likely to see the problem there. I don't think that the president is someone who is sitting around actively wishing for bad things for black people. In fact, I think he meant it when in the course of the campaign, at times when he said, I want economic success for the people who live in inner city neighborhoods. I want good things to happen for black people. I think he means those things. That's true as he understands his own truth. But does he have instinctive reactions to many situations that are grounded in his own racism and a sense of white supremacy? Absolutely.
Next question.
Hello, my name is Mia Young, and I'm from Emerson College up in Boston. So Angela Davis proposes the abolition of prisons as the only real solution to this issue of modern slavery. Do you believe that this is a solution, and if so, is it the only solution, or what are some other ways that we can combat this?
And as you answer that question, you may or may not know the figure, Dr. Carr. What % of African American men are in prison?
Oh, wow, that's a good question. I don't know. I mean, there have been a number of different statistics bandied about. I think, like I say, what is it, 1 in every 4 will have some contact with the criminal justice system, either having been arrested or detained. I've been arrested by the Capitol Hill police. I had a month past my tag was on the license plate, like it expired a month before, and I just hadn't gotten it renewed. So they pulled me over. It's been about 10 years ago. And then, really, are these cuffs necessary? No problem. Not my first time, not my last. So they might count me in the statistic. Actually locked up in either jail or prison. I think the number is smaller, but
Still wildly disproportionate.
oh, no question, no question.
If you've ever dealt with DC government, you know why you might want to delay it by a month or so.
Exactly. But it comes with a price. It depends on don't drive around. We know that. Don't drive around Capitol Hill after 10, 11 o'clock at night. Black, mind you, Steve Scully says it came back to the floor yesterday, and it was people of African descent who protected his life out there at the softball game. But anyway, forget that on your way to the next white supremacist meeting. And I wouldn't ask whether the president of the United States was racist or not. My question would be, in a world where the power of whiteness is in its invisibility. where the exception is the question rather than the rule. My question would be, how could he not be a racist? Just based on what he said and done over the last 4 years. But yeah, get rid of prisons. But if you get rid of prisons, that's not saying that you still don't have punishment. The question becomes, when did prisons become a thing? Again, all the questions we ask, we have to go back to ask, what's the origin of these institutions? I'm not saying you gotta go read Michelle Foucault, Birth of the Clinic, or Discipline and Punish, or you gotta go back and read Edward Wilmot Blyden from 1909, African Life and Customs, where he said you won't find even a word for prison in any of these languages, even though you have punishments. The question becomes, what is the objective of prison? And if we can achieve the objective differently, then how can you avoid it? Like I said, Michelle Alexander, I put it with my friend Tanya, I would put Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow on the same list as Between the World and Me. Yeah, and especially if you read Chauncey McIntyre's book, Criminalizing a Race, you know that there ain't no new Jim Crow. There's the structural criminalization of populations in this country that goes all the way back to debtors' prisons, which they claim they were going to get people to escape from. If they lock you up on something and keep you in jail for a month until they give you a trial, is that not debtor's prison in a way, because you can't afford the bail? That's what Kamala Harris and Rand Paul, who's like a broke clock right twice a day, is trying to at least get some legislation for. My bottom line is, yeah, abolish prisons. But if you're going to abolish the prisons, that will come as a consequence of re-examining what it means to be a human, not a citizen, because this citizenship thing bothers me. Because citizenship becomes a form of enhanced humanity. The whole Caribbean got wiped out. And what are we worried about? 15 American citizens were on the island of what? So yeah, abolishing prison to me speaks to a deeper question. What does it mean to be human in the world? And is the United States really, to borrow again from hip hop, about that life? And I would about that life.
And I would say very quickly, I can't say I disagree with that in any way. But I would say that getting rid of the buildings and the fenced enclosures that are prisons, in the same way that we were talking about with the young woman a moment ago, does not in and of itself solve any of these problems. And people who do really bad things, and there are people who do really bad things, they should be punished, they should be contained, separated from society. But there should not be all kinds of people in those places who didn't commit any crimes or who could be productive citizens or productive members of our society if they'd been better educated, or if the rest of our society worked better. I'm not attracted to as simple a line as get rid of all prisons. But I will say, and this may sound odd, right now I'm writing a book with Attorney General Holder that'll come out in a year or so about the crisis in the criminal justice system. And he doesn't feel quite the way I do about some of these things, but my view is that I feel about the American criminal justice system the same way the Republicans talk about the Affordable Care Act. And that is, it is so flawed. It is so entrenched in white supremacist ideas. It is a system designed in the 19th century to explicitly be a system of injustice for black people and justice for white people. And that is baked into the code, the computer code of our justice system so deeply and in such twisted ways that the only solution I can imagine is to pull it up out of the ground by the roots, just like the Republicans say about our healthcare system. I don't know that our justice system can be reformed. But knock down the prison buildings, maybe that's a part of it someday, but that by itself I don't think does the trick.
Thank you for the question. We could go for hours, and we're running out of time. We have time for 2 final questions on each side, so I apologize for those of you who have been waiting patiently. We've gone over a little longer, but I want to thank you both for being with us. This is such an interesting and important conversation.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Hi, Lauren Gilman from Texas Christian University. We talked a little bit about what happened over in Europe and Eastern Europe. Hungary kind of does the same thing. They had a lot of Soviet memorials after World War II, and instead of destroying them, they destroyed a lot of them, but they put them into a Soviet graveyard of sorts outside of Budapest as a way to remind themselves of what happened. And there's like a lot of different memorials that were there to glorify Hungarians that had killed other Hungarians when they tried to rebel in 1956. Is there a way to adapt that system in the US so that we can remove them from courthouses and different institutions, but preserve the history? It wouldn't solve any problems, but is there anything that we should do like that.
You've been there, so you've seen this, obviously, from first-hand experience? Your family from Hungary?
No.
The genius of America, I think, is in the proposition. I don't think human beings of our own accord, at least the way I understand migration history, would have chosen to create a place where you dump some of everybody in the world in one place and say, make a country. That's the genius. Not in any inherent exceptionalism, but in the prospects of doing that. Because ultimately, the world's going to have to do that. But this is very interesting. Now, I know people here don't need to know this, right? The best network on cable television is C-SPAN. I'm not just saying it because Steve's sitting here, but I'm saying, no, under pressure is the...
You approved that message.
No, seriously, no question. See, that's what I'm talking. Look, that's the first time I ever take a side. You ever watch him when he's listening to the callers? His face never changes. The Yoruba people call that
If you only knew what I was thinking.
Listen, man. The Yoruba people call that itutu, means coolness. It's a question of character. You can keep a face in front of anybody, and I'll tell you. But the reason I say that, in addition to that, is that the things you all cover, gavel to gavel, and this is directly to the point, are the things that should make for riveting television for anybody trying to understand, trying to work this experiment out. Remember when my friend Bree Newsom, whose father is over at the Afro-American Museum in Cincinnati, took down the Confederate flag, grabbed the Confederate flag out to the Carolina State House? There was a black dude out there for years who used to do it. He dressed in a Santa Claus suit. His name was Reverend E.X. Slade. That's what he called himself. The reason they had a fence around it because he was going to be across the street, and if the police moved for an inch, he was over there trying to set fire to the thing. On C-SPAN, the night they debated whether to take that flag down, you had one of every kind of American there is in the South Carolina State Legislature. And you saw debates, you saw tears, you saw people say, I grew up in white supremacy, but I want it down. You said, other people, I'm black, but I understand the compromise that was introduced by some of the legislators. And it was on all night. So you can go on the website now and watch it. What if we took them all down and put them in a museum? I'm watching about 3 o'clock in the morning, like, that's not a bad idea. Don't get rid of it, to your point. But narrate it, curate it in a place where you can manage it and then walk every school child through there. In fact, let them help write curriculum. Let every generation renew this conversation differently. But if it weren't for C-SPAN, I wouldn't have been able to see it. Why? Because the media often selects, as a Korean philosopher, Han, who's written a little book called In the Swarm. He said there's so much information, so much data out there that we are now in a form of society where we are all anonymous. We're sitting next to each other, talking to each other, but we're individuals. You have to have those common elements to build a society. I think that's an excellent suggestion, and I think then the Europeans, the Africans, like the South Africans who are narrating apartheid even as we speak, how you going to tell the story of Salvador Allende in Chile where September 11th means something very different? Let's have a conversation in the place where you put one of everybody on the planet and say, work it out. I think that is a suggestion, that's an observation from your direct experience that warrants more than just a passing acknowledgement. Maybe that's part of the debate. Let's put them somewhere.
Yeah, and I would totally agree with that. And in fact, it is a wonderful thing that we have entered a period now where there is the Black History Museum in St. Louis, and now there's the Smithsonian Museum here, and there are, state by state, there now are these museums that celebrate Black experience, Black struggle, and that's a wonderful thing that has happened. It's still curious how difficult it often is for those things to occur, how many people oppose them, but it's also time for us as a nation, for us to in a similar sort of way that even in Mississippi, that the Mississippi legislature was made up overwhelmingly of super conservative white Republicans appropriated the dollars to build a Black History Museum in Mississippi. Now maybe that was a cynical cover-up of their real racist attitudes. I don't know. I think probably not entirely, even if it is partly that. But it's an acknowledgement that that's a part of the story that needs to be told and people need to learn about in a way that state once would have said didn't need to happen. It's also time now for us to say there should be exactly the sort of thing that you're talking about. There should be places that the Holocaust Museum here in Washington is not a celebratory museum, and it is also not simply a memorial. It is an exploration of how this terrible thing happened. And there should be similar museums that relate to the most terrible things that have happened in American society. And we're talking about one of them. And the other obvious one is what happened to the native peoples of our country that we still have even more of an inability to grapple with. But absolutely, I would, to to selectively move a lot of this iconography and statues and such into the right kind of place that would be a genuine teaching instrument, I think would be absolutely the right thing to do. There is no reason to hang on to every single piece of concrete yard art that was ordered out of a catalog in 1910, you know, and all these, you know, which is how it worked. You know, these salesmen went from town to town and said, "Hey, the next town over has."
You should make that point. Don't block, because that's where these statues came from.
Oh yeah. That's just, you know, it was just in this mega white supremacist era. You know, these manufacturers realized that there was a market and just going from town to town and saying, "Hey, next town over's got a better one than you. What's wrong with you? Don't you love dead Confederates?" And so they would put up a monument and try to outdo the last one that somebody else did. There's no artistic value to those things. There's very little historic value to those things. There's nothing rare about them. You know, so they don't all need to be cryonically preserved for all the time. We're not an ancestor worship society. But something like what you're describing would be absolutely appropriate.
Final point in our remaining minute. What did the two of you learn from each other this morning?
Well, I learned, no, I mean, because it's so much. See, what I have to do now, you know, Jim Comey joined the Howard faculty for a year, right? So
We covered it.
About a month ago, right? He tried to anyway, I was shouting, right? About a month ago, I had a chance to meet him. I said, "Yeah, man, after this meeting, I'm going down and write down everything we talked about." But anyway, so that's going to happen. I'm going to memorialize this. What I certainly learned from this conversation generally, and certainly from you, is that, you know, our history as a country has not yet been told. What I learned from that book, of course, was about a system that connects very closely to the legal structure that I've tried to understand. But today, I think what I learned is that there has to be room for the possibility of American exceptionalism, and that I need to be very mindful of what that might look like. Because people change from moment to moment, and you kind of have to narrate some of that today. So.
Thank you. I had a similar reaction to you on both of those counts. My first thought was, as you rattled off so many of those literary, you did leave out the condemnation of blackness of Khalil Muhammad.
Yes, my friend Khalil Gibran, no question.
But you, as always, you left me with the sense of that I need to rush out and write down everything you referred to and make sure that I actually fully comprehend it. But also, I just think the conversation we've had here, it was a reminder to me as you were talking, and I think it's important for young people to be aware of this too, that here the two of us, I think, share a worldview on all of this that is extraordinarily similar, fundamentally come from the right place, fundamentally have the same instincts about all of these things, but at the same time, you know, faced with these more precise questions from Steve or from the audience, you know, kind of have different takes on some parts of it. And it may be that both of us are right or both of us are wrong, but it reflects to me that there is no one answer to any of these things. And the person that you think disagrees with you or you assume disagrees with you is probably not a demon who has been sent to harass you by Satan. It's just another person, and may be wrong, and also may be right, or maybe in between. It's always good to be reminded of those things.
Dr. Gray Carr of Howard University, Doug Blackmon, author, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, and also from the University of Virginia. To paraphrase Gray Carr, these two cats deserve a standing ovation. Thank you. Thank you both very, very much.